All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tracy Philippi. I'm the Library Programming and Outreach Specialist for the Village of Cottage Grove and the Cottage Grove Library Board. Oh, somebody's in the waiting room. Steve, I think it's your wife.
Ah, nice.
Letting her in. We're really great to see you at today's Lunch and Learn, Understanding Autism for Parents, Families, Teachers of Newly Diagnosed Children. Before I introduce our speaker today, Trustee David Peterson, I just want to provide a few housekeeping rules. So as you saw, we are recording today's presentation and we'll upload this onto our YouTube channel so it can be an evergreen resource for residents in the community. So if you don't want your image shared on YouTube, please just keep your camera off. We do have another upcoming free virtual program. On May 9th, we're going to welcome author Jack Mitchell, who is from the Wisconsin Historical Society, and he'll talk about his book, Wisconsin on the Air, 100 Years of Public Broadcasting in the State That Invented It. So that will take place at Village Hall in Cottage Grove, but we also have a virtual option available as well. If you do have any questions that come up, David would love to answer them as they arise. So you can either raise your hand or just stick them in the chat box, and he and I will both keep our eyes on that as well. And finally, I'd like to thank our in-kind sponsor today, Friends of the Cottage Grove Library. So with that, I will introduce today's speaker. The session is led by David Peterson, an experienced advocate and parent to 3 boys, one of whom is on the autism spectrum. Professionally, David works at Microsoft, where he seamlessly blends his passion for technology with his dedication to supporting families impacted by autism. Beyond his advocacy work, he enjoys barbecue, computers, and staying engaged in politics. So, Dave, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Tracy. So, hey, everybody. Again, David Peterson. I've been engaged in these types of presentations for a lot of years, and I really love giving these presentations because it's a lot of folks kind of like to share some of their own stories, and so I like to make these conversational. So feel free to interrupt me at any point. I want to make this, it's your time. I want to make it valuable for you. So as you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. Again, this is really around understanding autism or Autism 101. It's really for parents, family, teachers, friends, acquaintances of newly diagnosed children. So we're gonna cover kind of like what is autism. We're going to talk about a handful of different things, but again, I want to make this your time. So as you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. So moving on. So again, we'll go in not super deep on autism, like what is it and defining it, but at least we'll kind of give you the textbook definition, and then I can kind of give you some of my understanding with my own autistic kiddo. We'll talk about through some special considerations, things like IEPs and things like long-term waiver and some of the other supports that are in and around the community that can help you. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Autism Society of South Central Wisconsin. I've been engaged with them again for a lot of years now, and they do a lot of good in the autism community. So happy to talk about that as well. So with that, let's talk about autism. So what is autism? And again, some of you might have autistic children, might be newly diagnosed, you might know somebody. Again, there's textbook definitions, and you ask any autistic parent, you're probably going to get a different definition every time. So what is autism? No, it's really a spectrum disorder. It affects individuals differently to varying degrees. Sometimes it's referred to as ASD. The one thing that I can guarantee you about every autistic child is the only consistent thing is that they can be inconsistent from one child to the next. Very, very different. It can look very different. The personalities can be different. Behaviors can be different. They can react to stimuli different. I think just the one true fact here is that they're all very, very different, but they're all very, very special at the end of the day. So let's talk about some common traits of autism. So what are, even though they're all different, right? What are some common traits we see? And again, these are not molds, right? These people are very, very, these kids and these adults, they're very, very special, right? And so what are some common traits that we see though? So a lot of times autism at its base is a social disorder, right? So it's social communication and interaction deficits, right? They have problems relating to others, and problems again that can be somewhat of a charged word. I think that when you encounter someone who's on the spectrum and you're not really sure, or they don't introduce themselves on the spectrum, sometimes you're like, man, that's just something felt off about that, right? And again, that's not, I think when I say that, what I try to tell to people is like when you encounter autistic individuals, just have a little bit more grace, right? Have a little bit more understanding. And honestly, that's probably true for everybody. That's regardless if you're on the spectrum or not. We just all need to give ourselves just a little extra grace, a little extra time, a little bit more understanding. But especially if you have an autistic kid or someone that you're related to or close friends with, again, their brains function differently. So communicating them can present some challenges, but also it presents a unique opportunity, right? Some other things we see is restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior, or they have interests in or activities. When my child was diagnosed, my brother asked me, he saw Rain Man and he goes, "When are we going to teach Cole how to count cards?" That's again, thank you, Hollywood, but no thank you, right? It's at the end of the day, what it's really about, it's about passions. Autistic individuals tend to have passions, or they exhibit repetitive patterns of behavior or interests, and they, almost to a stim, if you will, right? Somewhat, they just really get into things. What my kiddo, he is super into dinosaurs. Like, he knows more about dinosaurs than anybody I've ever known, and that started at a very, very early age, at about 3. If you've never had the chance, I highly recommend you go to Burpee Museum in Rockford. Rockford has they have, in that museum, they have the largest T-Rex fossil in the world, and it's the most complete as well. We went there. They have a lab in the basement. Cole was down there. I think he was 3.5, maybe 4, and he was having a conversation with a grad student down there about dinosaurs, right? And so, I mean, how cool is it for this little kid to have a conversation with a doctoral student, right, who's cleaning bones? I mean, that is amazing. That is awesome. And we really, as within my family, we celebrate that. We encourage that. Whereas others, who aren't aware of autism might see that as a negative pattern, maybe an addiction. We really want to we want to give ourselves some grace here. We want to understand that these are very, very special people, and they have very, very special interests. And that's what, at the end of the day, what does it matter if they're into dinosaurs or counting cards or, Matchbox cards? It doesn't matter at the end of the day. That's what fulfills them, and that's what makes them happy. And then on top of it, unusual responses to factors in their environment. I grew up in a time where kids wearing earmuffs at school was kind of frowned upon, or people looked at that as a negative. Nowadays, it's thankfully it's not seen as something negative. School buildings can be very scary places, and so my kiddo wears earmuffs a good amount of the day. Um, you know, he, you know, Thankfully we don't have chalkboards anymore, so we don't have to hear that anymore. But loud environments like a gym or a locker room with a lot of hard surfaces, things can echo, and it can make them very uncomfortable. Um, on top of it too, maybe certain fabrics, right? So pajamas can be like, fleece is a big thing for Cole. He's not really doesn't care for fleece. Let's put it that way. So you just know that, right? And so we don't dress him in that stuff, right? And so it's, again, a lot of times you'll see an interaction, or you'll see a response to something, and it might be jarring even for you as a parent, or a family member or a teacher. But again, it's always nice to ask some questions, and again, slow down a little bit, gives yourself some grace, give that person some grace, and try to understand what is the underlying response, right? What are we ultimately trying to get to? I remember when Cole was 3 years old, he hated wearing t-shirts with tags, and who knew, like, a tag could ruin an entire day? Well, that's, through trial and error, that's what we found out. So it's things like that a lot of times autistic kiddos can be either the easiest ones to deal with, or sometimes the hardest ones to deal with in your day-to-day life, especially when you talk to teachers. And so little things like a tag or a fleece sweatshirt or a sound can make life really, really difficult for these kiddos. So it's just something to be aware of. And again, these are some of the common traits of autism, but I've given you 3 major ones here, but I could easily talk about another dozen to 2 dozen other traits that we might see. But again, just because someone has these traits doesn't necessarily mean that they have autism. So it's all about grace and understanding. Let's talk about some of the social communication difficulties. And it really breaks down to 2 groups. You have speaking, and then non-speaker and nonverbal children. I'll start from the bottom and work my way up. For nonverbal children, right, it's a lack of verbal communication is caused by an inability. It's not a choice, right? That's how, again, the autistic brain is wired differently than a neurotypical brain. So and again, I've seen grandparents, and I've given these talks sometimes, and grandparents or great grandparents come and say, "Why can't my autistic grandchild just speak?" It's like, it's not a by choice. It's because they literally can't, right? And so We use other methods of communication, so behavior, sign language, thumbs up, thumbs down. There's all kinds of ways to communicate with nonverbal kiddos. But again, it's not by choice. I see a lot of iPad usage. There's a lot of adaptive devices out in the world today. These can be really, really helpful to help, these kiddos communicate to the rest of the world. And they can have these kiddos can be very, very articulate and very, very smart and very, very aware of their surroundings. And again, if they could talk, they would. For those that do speak, and Cole is verbal, we can have challenges with transitions between topics and phrases. A lot of times, like especially in my child's case, his receptive language is actually lower than his expressive language. So in Cole's case, right, his language is kind of like Swiss cheese, right? So think about it like, for those that don't understand Spanish, you've all heard the term Feliz Navidad, or you heard the song. I know it has something to do about Christmas, but I don't know exactly what it is, right? And that's kind of how Cole works, right? And so he will hear you, he'll kind of formulate in his own head what he thinks you're talking about, and then he'll actually script. And so he will kind of like have difficulty kind of transitioning between topics or phrases, or he'll just change the topic altogether for you, right? So it can be a challenge sometimes. But ultimately, these kiddos are trying to communicate, and all behavior is, all responses to behavior, they're trying to communicate to you, right? Echolalia, or repeating phrases many times. Again, this is something, it's for Cole, it's a bit of an audio stim. So it feels good to say the same word or the same phrase over and over and over again. Much to his brother's dismay, he continues to do it. It can get annoying at times, but again, it's all about, helping his brothers understand what's going on in the world and why is Cole doing this and how is he doing it. Again, I've been around a lot of autistic kiddos. This can be very, very common. It's nothing to be alarmed about. Again, we see all kinds of kids. That's totally age appropriate, especially for younger children, like 2 to 4. Echolalia is very, very common. I've even seen it in adults. It's not anything to be alarmed about. It's just something that they're trying, their brain is literally stimming. And then lastly, speaking in a way that seems off topic, or they're scripting other material. Again, Cole has this encyclopedic knowledge of every movie and TV show he's ever seen. And the unbelievable part about Cole is the fact that he can rattle these things off, and it's within the topic. It's appropriate. It's to be able to use it. But again, he's just trying to script. He's trying to contribute to the conversation. So this scripting can be really cool because they can remember things, esoteric details of specific movies or TV shows or music videos or YouTube videos and that sort of thing. Again, it might seem off topic, but again, they're ultimately just trying to communicate with you, and they're trying to, contribute to the conversation. Overall, again, the autistic brain can have difficulty reading and understand facial expressions. Sarcasm is an unbelievably difficult skill to understand and to interpret, even for neurotypical people sometimes. But for autistic folks, it's almost impossible. It takes a lot of training. It's not something that again, it's not a can't or a won't. There are specific behaviors within humans that can be very, very difficult for the autistic brain to understand, without any training or explanation or description. So Cole really, really, really struggles with sarcasm. And so, his older brother loves to then use sarcasm constantly. So it's something again, in our own house, we're trying to help him understand that, like, look, buddy, you just can't say sarcasm. You can't say things, or, figures of speech or sarcastic figures of speech. It can be very, very difficult for him to understand. So really, really important there. I'll pause there. Any questions so far? No? Okay. Kind of moving on from that, difficulties relating to others, right? So again, we're talking about sarcasm, we're talking about social cues, facial expressions. That can be very, very difficult for some autistic kiddos. Furthermore, identifying feelings in their self and others can be really, really hard. Again, because this is, at the end of the day, this is autism is about the social world. It's not necessarily a cognitive diagnosis, right? So understanding feelings in yourself or emotions. You can also have, in autistic kiddos, they can have issues with interoception. So understanding what the body's trying to tell the brain, right? So some autistic kiddos don't know what hunger feels like, or they don't know what frustration feels like. and a lot of times these feelings, right, it's your brain communicating with your body that something is wrong or something, you're upset about something, and an autistic body can't necessarily interpret those signals. So again, there are things that you can do. You can work with occupational therapists, you can work with speech therapists, um, physical therapists. There are things that you can do to help train their mind and their body to understand those things. But again, regulating responses can also be very difficult, right? So again, you have a feeling in your brain, it's communicating to your body. Your body might, maybe you're getting anxious or you're getting overwhelmed. These are things that that maybe neurotypical kids can understand, but the autistic brain can have very, very difficult times with these things. Could lead to meltdowns, can lead to crying, can lead to other issues, right? Because again, especially as autistic kiddos get older, they start to become aware of these things, right? And so it can be very difficult for them to relate or try to help others understand. And a lot of times I feel really bad for Cole, because Cole wants to communicate to his peers at school, like, look, here are the problems I have. I understand that might be difficult for you. Help me help you, kind of thing. So like it can be, especially middle school and high school, can be a really trying time for an autistic kiddo. So it's really key to try to recognize these things and get them the help and the support that they need. Further, might be slow to process conversations. Again, depending on language skills within an autistic kiddo, it might need a little bit more processing time. And again, this is same for neurotypical kiddos too. So again, it's all about grace and understanding. We can also have stacked intellectual disabilities. So you could have a kiddo with autism and then ADHD too, right? And then you have typical neuro or age appropriate kind of developmental issues that pop up from time to time. So like a lot of for sometimes these autistic kiddos, they can have stacked, and I don't want to call them issues, but they can have things that they have to overcome, especially around same age peers. So it can really widen the gap at times. Autistic kiddos, though, are fully capable of maintaining friendships. It may take longer, it might look a little different, but they are absolutely capable of maintaining and holding really fulfilling and happy friendships. And at the end of the day, autistic kiddos, they want to be a part of the community, right? And they want to do it their own way. And that's, again, we all need to recognize that and give them space and understanding and grace. Any questions? No? Okay. Let's go back to unusual responses. I kind of gave you a little bit of an idea of what that looks like. Some autistic kiddos can be very active, some can be very inactive. And that can change from day to day. And again, that's not uncommon for, that's also age appropriate for some kids, depending on the age. Autistic kiddos can have short attention spans or easily distracted. Again, these are things that age appropriate as well. Whirls or spins, again, we're talking about stimming, right? Rocks, paces, flaps. You can see that in younger kiddos, you can see that in older autistic kiddos. Again, we talked about certain noise, they can pull away or startle to touch. The other thing too, again, I kind of mentioned the proprioception, right? Exhibits unusual or no sense of pain. That can be, again, it's the autistic brain struggling to understand the signals of the body that are telling it, right? Sensitive bright lights may panic if overwhelmed by stimuli. A lot of these, and again, sometimes for neurotypical folks, these kinds of stimuli, if there's a loud bang, you might cover your ears, or you might, wince, or you might, shrink. For some autistic kiddos, it can trigger a fight or flight response, right? So something to be aware of as you're working with these kiddos is be prepared for things, right? And then trouble in crowds too. For Cole, as an example, Cole can vomit when he gets in a crowd that's too big. The kid absolutely loves Disney, he loves Universal, but we go there and there's a very good chance he might vomit. So it's just something we have to be prepared for. A lot of times my parents will ask me, they'll go, man, you have to do an awful lot to have an autistic kiddo. It's like, well, you have to do a lot to have kids, period. Thanks, mom and dad. But an autistic kiddo can add a little bit extra planning. That's what I think about it. It just takes a little bit extra planning, but it's not like it's overly difficult. It's not, it's not life altering. It just, it just takes a little bit more, right? And again, at the end of the day, in our family, it's just all about giving everybody what they need to succeed, right? Some of the other family reported challenges that we've seen from an Autism Society perspective, written instructions can be unbelievably helpful. so storyboards or foreshadowing can be unbelievably helpful for autistic kiddos. Transitioning between tasks, again, that's kind of where the written instructions can help autistic kiddos, because then they know what's coming. They have an understanding, they have an expectation. We're just not springing things on them in the last minute. And frankly, that's good advice for even neurotypical people, right? If people know what to expect, we have less issues, bar none. We can see a lot of kids chewing items. We've had some chewing habits in Cole. We've seen that. There's definitely chewers, there's mouth guards, there's all kinds of things. And honestly, if there's I can guarantee any issue you're seeing or any challenge you're facing, there is an aid out there that can help you, right? Be it a book or a piece of advice or some sort of gear. Again, I'm speaking more to chewing, but again, there are lots of things out there that can help you. So I always tell autistic parents of autistic kiddos that you don't have to suffer in silence. There's lots of support groups. There's things like what we're doing today. There's also the Autism Society. There's Facebook. There's lots of ways you can get help for what you're dealing with. It's there. You haven't seen anything that someone hasn't already been through. So why suffer in silence, right? Sleeping, eating, toilet training, those are all, very, very common within autistic kiddos. I think we have, the biggest jar of melatonin under the sun you can find at Costco at our house to try to get Cole to sleep. Again, for us, Cole can either be the easiest kid on the planet to work with, or he can be the most difficult. And sometimes it's really, really simple solutions to get him, to be the easiest kiddo. Toilet training for him, we didn't really have him toilet trained. I think it was 6, maybe 7 years old. So it was not. And again, that's not uncommon to hear from parents of autistic kiddos. From a challenging behavior perspective, we can, redirecting and disciplining autistic kiddos can be very, very tough. I don't know how else to put it. If you just it can keep you up at night. I'll put it that way. Eloping or wandering, again, this is extremely common, especially in younger kiddos and older kiddos too. But it's really, really scary when you have to put up. I mean, we live in the winter. We have winter here. It can get very cold. We used to put Cole's shoes up in the winter so he wouldn't leave the house because he didn't like cold in his feet. So we had to put his shoes up. So again, these are very, very big concerns. I had to put a security system in the house, not to keep bad people out, but to keep Cole in the house. So, because then we have a chime on the door that goes off anytime anybody opens the door. Thankfully, I think we're for the most part over the elopement, but it's still something we consistently worry about because again, especially with elopement for us, the big concern was what if he was gravitating towards water? What if he goes over to a retention pond or he finds himself in some water somewhere? We want to make sure he knows how to swim, right? So we take his shoes away, we teach him how to swim. It's one less thing that we have, his parents have to worry about. We're still worried about it, but again, it's trying to give him the tools and supports in place to make sure that he's safe, happy, and secure. And then lastly, difficulty understanding basic safety concepts. We talked at length with Cole, and I've talked to lots of parents too. This is a huge, huge concern for parents of autistic kiddos. It's like crossing the street. What does a moving car look like? What does a parked car look like? What does the end of a sidewalk look like? What is a stoplight? What's a stop sign? Again, kids don't come with manuals, neurotypical especially, and autistic especially, but you have to break everything down into its finite pieces in order to help an autistic kiddo understand what maybe a neurotypical kid, you wouldn't have to break it down so much. But again, at the end of the day, we just want these kids to be safe, right? And so breaking these things down is really, really helpful. But again, it can be very difficult because Cole just didn't understand that a car is not going to stop for you in the street. So don't walk in the middle of the street. So it was a lot of work, a lot of effort, and thankfully, I'm still worried about it. So I don't know if the worry ever fully goes away, but it's maybe that's just me being an overprotective parent. I don't know, but any questions so far? No? Okay. So how many people have autism? We know that 1 in 36 children in the US are diagnosed with autism. It really varies from state to state. I think it just depends on the resources that are available within the state. Thankfully, in Wisconsin, we have lots and lots of resources. The ADRC is a good example. The UW Wiseman Center is a good example. There's lots of really good places that you can go that it doesn't cost you anything, right? Especially in this state. But other states are not so lucky. Around a third of those with autism also meet the definition of having an intellectual disability. When we get into talking about IEPs and that sort of thing, we'll talk about what that means and in that. But again, there's an educational diagnosis and there's a medical diagnosis, and we'll talk about both. Again, this talk is really geared towards people who have newly diagnosed children or around newly diagnosed children. It's really a journey. You as an adult, you're going to feel denial, anger, fear, guilt, powerlessness, grief, and mix of other emotions. And I'll tell you, it's a journey. You're gonna come back to this at times. That's just the nature of being, that's just the nature of being a parent, if nothing else. But just know that these feelings are really part of the journey, but only for some time, right? Your child is the same beautiful kid they were before the diagnosis. I wish somebody would have told me that the day we got the diagnosis. Nothing really changed. He was still the same quirky, fun kid we knew before, and he was the same one after when we walked out of the Wiseman Center. The only thing that really changes is that now you can attain the tools and the resources to help them achieve their highest potential in life. And that's all we want for all of our children, right? Every family has to decide for themselves what's best to share the diagnosis with their child. In our case, we told Cole. He understood. He accepted it. It was not anything guilt-driven or anything negative. We just said, "Hey, buddy, this is, some people have brown hair, some people have blonde hair. You have autism." That's kind of how we treated it. So we chose to openly discuss it. Others may wait until the child starts to ask questions and begins to understand some of their struggles or their differences. There is no right or wrong answer. Every family is different. Every autistic kiddo is different. I think a lot of times in society today, we want to apply judgment to every choice we make. And at the end of the day, it's what's best for you and your kiddo. And there is no right or wrong answer. And you shouldn't let anyone guilt you into thinking you did something right or wrong either. I think that's really important. Special considerations for women and girls. Boys are diagnosed 4 times more than girls. That's just a fact. We know girls are more likely to be underdiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or diagnosed later in life. Truly means that the earlier you get the diagnosis, the sooner you can start to get services and help them and get them, again, we want to get them all the tools needed to have the highest potential in their life, okay? Many traits of autism will portray themselves differently in girls. And again, we've talked at length about different traits of autism. But girls tend to have less repetitive behaviors. They have different play skills and an ability to mimic others in social situations. Again, sometimes, and I hate when people say this, like, well, that kiddo doesn't look autistic. Autistic kids don't have a look, right? That's just not reality, right? And so it's not like Downs, it's not like other diagnoses. It's just it's all internally, it's all neurological. And then last part, and this breaks my heart, is girls with autism are more likely to suffer from anxiety and or depression. And there's a whole host of reasons why that. Some of it culturally, some of it within individual families. There's all kinds of reasons for that. But again, it just absolutely breaks my heart. I really like the quote down in the lower right-hand corner, right? Trying to force a child to be more neurotypical, i.e. doing lots of masking, can be a very negative message to an autistic child. Understand your child as an individual and not a stereotypical autistic kiddo. The one that breaks my heart the most, and we typically don't see it within Monona Grove School District, but I have heard of it happening in Wisconsin, is where teachers make autistic kiddos look you in the face, and they have to do it for 3 seconds. That's incredibly common. That's called masking, and that's not right, and that's not good. It can be incredibly negative for a kid to have to do that. And again, response to stimuli, eye contact can be very, very debilitating for autistic kiddos. So I try to tell my parents, don't make Cole stare at you. That's not nice. And if you want to make sure that he's understanding you, there's other ways to do that, right? And so talk about special considerations for different racial and ethnic groups. Autism occurs in children of all racial and ethnic groups. There is no group that gets less or more. It happens in any race or ethnicity. Research has historically indicated discrepancies in time of diagnosis between racial and ethnic groups. Again, I think for me, it comes down to access to resources and knowing when to apply those resources. It can be very difficult. And again, depending on your socioeconomic, racial, or ethnicity, sometimes that can have an impact too. It is getting better, but again, there is still room for improvement. Again, Wisconsin has some really great resources. Again, ADRC, the Wiseman Center, Autism Society, South Central Wisconsin. These all can help you find resources as you're kind of navigating this journey. Pause there. Any thoughts? Any questions? Any
Well, I
anecdotes?
know that with all the children that I do work with, I am a special education advocate, and communication is 30% spoken, and that's by neurotypical, that is by neurodiverse or neurospicy, however you want to label yourself as. But I think it's really important that all adults and all children understand that even the neurotypical adults, they hit period of non-communicado. If you're sick, then you're going to grunt your needs versus being able to express that. So we need to really understand that doesn't matter if you are speaking, non-speaking, we all hit those periods. And there's a lot of different ways to communicate.
Absolutely. And that, I think that's as a parent of an autistic kiddo, that's probably one of the biggest lessons I've learned, is that communication is, the spoken word is only a small percentage of the overall what communication is, right? A look, a glance, a stare, a grunt. Those are all forms of communication. And I think sometimes culturally we get a bit reductionist and say, well, communication is spoken word. No, that's not at all what that is. That's a very small percentage of it. So and knowing that and accepting that fact can make life a little bit easier as you're trying to work with an autistic kiddo, right? And understanding signals and signs, right? Right now for Cole, we're working on thumbs up, thumbs down, thumb sideways, right? That can be unbelievably helpful, especially in moments of high disturbance, right? So he's on the verge of a meltdown. I don't know how to communicate to you people that I'm not having a good day, right? Just and Denise, to your point, as an adult, it can be very difficult when you're in a heightened state to be able to say, hey, I need to take a pause. I need to go outside right now and take a break. It's just easier to like grunt or get really angry or start swearing, right? Like, and again, autistic kiddos gravitate towards swearing very, because as adults, we're modeling behavior, and autistic kiddos glom on to adults swear when they're frustrated and angry. And then autistic kiddos start swearing, and then schools start yelling at them. No, Cole, you're not supposed to swear. He goes, well, my dad, when he gets angry, he swears. It's like, that's a really difficult lesson to teach kiddos. And I think at some point we just kind of, if an adult in our house, at least, if an adult is going to swear, then Cole's kind of allowed to. We try not to, but again, it's all about modeling behavior and modeling communication and saying what are good outlets for communication, what are not so good outlets for communication. Swearing, probably not appropriate for a 12-year-old, but giving me a thumbs up or a thumbs down, totally appropriate. Okay. So Denise, thank you for your point. Okay, so let's talk about supports. And again, I've kind of talked on some of them, but let's go into more detail here, right? So this is super important for kiddos as you get into school. We'll talk a little bit about an IEP we'll kind of touch on it in one of these bullets, but again, it's important to note here that there's two kinds of diagnosis: a medical diagnosis and then an educational diagnosis. From a medical standpoint, it's obviously done by a medical professional, so a physician, psychologist, neurologist. Lots of folks go to the Wiseman. I think there's a whole host of services in and around Dane County that can perform the diagnosis. Like I said, many autism treatment providers are providing them. They use the DSM-5 criteria. So DSM-5 is this big encyclopedic book that outlines all psychological disorders and diagnoses. And so all the criteria under autism is what's used to diagnose whether or not a child has autism. For a medical diagnosis, that is what you need for state and locally funded services. So CLTS waiver or children's long-term support waiver, insurance mandated services, depending on your insurance carrier, family support, respite, that sort of thing. So in order to qualify for those services, you have to have a medical diagnosis. Let's go over to the educational side, right? That will be performed by a school personnel. Typically a school psychologist, some teachers might feel that, but again, they typically the school district will want to bring in a psychologist for that. It's not valid for outside therapy services. The educational diagnosis is leveraging the Wisconsin DPI autism criteria, which are different from the DSM-5. They are not the same. There's some similarities. There might be some overlaps. By and large, they are different, and depending on your perspective, it might be very different. It might be somewhat different. But in order to have the educational diagnosis, that's what's needed for school services. So things like an IEP, 504 accommodations, behavioral intervention plan, that sort of thing. That's where the educational piece comes in. I've talked to a lot of folks, depending on the school district that you're in, IEPs can either be relatively easy to navigate and get, and other school districts can be very, very difficult to get. I think at the end of the day, my biggest piece of advice when it comes to an IEP is once you qualify for an IEP, school districts in certain school districts, especially in the state, will sometimes try to tell you, well, if they have autism, we can only do this, and this service-wise. That you can't do that. That's against the law. You have to, once you have an IEP, if what the child needs is XYZ, and you can show cause for that, then they have to provide that, right? We can certainly talk about funding. We can talk about taxes. There's all kinds of conversations we can get mired in here, but it's the key differentiator here is there's a medical diagnosis. You need that for children's long-term waiver. You need that for insurance. For an IEP or a 504, you need the educational diagnosis. They don't always overlap. Sometimes they do. It just depends on your specific scenario and your specific criteria. But at the end of the day, I think what these are really getting at is how do we get these kiddos the services and the help that they need to be successful? My kiddo has an IEP and is on the long-term waiver as well. So children's long-term waiver, again, state and well, it's paid for by the state, but then also from the county perspective here in Dane County, can be very, very helpful. Long-term waiver is interesting. I think they prefer to, they're all about security and safety. That's kind of first and foremost. They love to talk about fences. They love to talk about adaptive security devices. There's all kinds of things they like to talk about. But at the end of the day, there's if you have a long-term waiver, it's different for everybody. You get a caseworker. You work with the caseworker. You decide what services and equipment or gear you need. For a long time we had a Gizmo Pal. Verizon sells them. We used it to try to track Cole, right? So it was there's lots of Angel Sense. There's lots of other services that you can use to track kiddos. Long-term waiver can in some cases pay for them, in other cases they can't. Just depends on your caseworker and the conversation you have. But again, for us, it's always been because Cole's has had an elopement risk. I want to be able to find him anywhere in the world he decides to wander off to. I would need to be able to find him. In our particular case, long-term waiver would not pay for the Gizmo Pal, but again, we just really needed to have it and soon. Sometimes it can be easier to pay for these things on your own, but again, it depends on your own financial situation. So I'll pause there. Any questions about this, Tracy?
Yes, just wanted to add something and then ask you a question, Dave. We have our CLTS appointment for my autistic child, our intake appointment on Friday. So I'm really looking forward to that. But we also have CCS because my autistic child also has an anxiety and depression diagnosis. So that is CCS is more mental health support. So we have in-home family therapy that's completely covered by the county weekly, which has been really awesome. But my question for you, Dave, is so my oldest kiddo was diagnosed last year when she was 8, and we had been trying to get her diagnosed since she was 3 or 4, but she continually refused to participate in the diagnosis or in the evaluation. And so they just kept saying, come back next year, come back next year. And every year they'd say, we can't diagnose her because she keeps refusing to participate. And in hindsight, I'm just wondering what you would have recommended to parents who find themselves in that situation where they're unable to get the support because they can't get the diagnosis.
Right. I think, and Tracy, you and I have known each other for a long time now. I think what we've recently discovered in our own case is PDA profile, or persistent demand for autonomy.
Yes.
I think there's another, again, there.
Pathological demand avoidance.
Thank you. There's It's interesting because PDA is not within the DSM-5 today, and it's not recognized as an actual diagnosis in the States. It is, however, it is in the UK. Monona Grove School District does acknowledge that that is a profile, but specifically like the Wiseman Center is certainly aware of it, but they can't necessarily use it because insurance companies don't recognize it, right? And so specifically, Tracy, I think in my case and in your case, I think our kiddos exhibit PDA profile or symptoms of that, right? And again, I don't have a diagnosis from a medical professional, so I'm just the random guy who thinks he knows what he's talking about, applying this to my own child. I think that we're finding in the research that my wife and I are doing is PDA profile is incredibly common in autistic kiddos. It is it's not, it doesn't go hand in hand with autism, but it certainly does for a lot of autistic kiddos, right? So you can have PDA profile without autism, but by and large, a lot of autistic kiddos do exhibit a PDA profile. So what is a PDA profile? So it's all about persistent desire for autonomy, right? So it's all about shared control. It's about, I want to control my own destiny. I don't like demanding words. Don't make me do things. And again, I'm boiling the ocean here, right? But I think in these cases, and again, if anybody's on Instagram, Speech Dude is who you want to go see. Speech Dude gives you all kinds of tips and hints, and we've been leveraging that rather heavily lately. But Tracy, I think to your point, if your kiddo is exhibiting, PDA profile symptoms, I think that's something to note to the provider is like, look, we're using really demanding language here, and we can't get, I need the diagnosis in order to have services, but I can't have services until I have the diagnosis. So what do I do? And I think that, ultimately I wish I had a magic 8 ball that could say the exact thing you can do, but I think that working with pediatricians, I think working with school psychologists, I think it just depends on the age of the child and where you're at in the journey. But I think for us, once we finally discovered PDA, it really opened a lot of doors, and in terms of people understanding and being able to work with us. Because prior to that, it was a lot of just meltdowns or inability to, like, I can't work with this child because your child is just too difficult to work with, right? And I think that once you start to learn how to formulate the language, I think the language is really important. And back to Denise's point, it's all about communication. And so how do we communicate to your kiddo that, hey, we really need to do this, and maybe we need to chunk it out. Maybe we do it 10 minutes at a time. And again, I'm throwing all kinds of ideas against the wall here, but there are ways to do that. But again, to your point, Tracy, it's like, I didn't know about PDA until I had the diagnosis, right? So how am I supposed to know? And I think it's, this is the struggle of trying to get a diagnosis sometimes, right? And I think truthfully, I think the best thing to do, if you and I could rewind the clock and go back and say, well, what could you and your husband have done differently? There's things like the Autism Society, there's definitely Facebook, and I know you were doing that, but I think at the end of the day, I think you just have to give yourself some grace too, and know that these are not easy kiddos at times, and it can be really tough. But I think that looking at PDA profile, and I think once it's finally recognized, I think my hope is that things will start to change, and that we'll understand how to work with some of these kiddos. Trust is key, language is key, and not putting demands on these kiddos is really, really important, which is the antithesis to public schools, right? Public schools are made to create, well-behaved, obedient, people at the end of the day is what the public school system is built for. So it's like that runs exactly counter for somebody who has a PDA profile, right? And so, but we can work with it, right? It just takes some time and understanding and some grace. So I don't know if I answered your question, Tracy. If nothing else, I identify with your situation. I totally empathize with you.
Well, thank you for bringing up PDA. That was going to be one of my questions later on, if you could address that. And once my husband and I learned about it and consumed as many books as we possibly could and started listening to podcasts, we're like, this is it. This is exactly what our child has.
Yep.
And Denise actually on the call was a resource to me earlier. So thank you, Denise. I put a recommendation for the book Low Demand Parenting, which just came out recently. By Amanda Dykman, I think her name is. She also has a podcast. That was a really great book for anybody else that thinks they might have a PDA child or wants to support a PDA child in their life.
Yeah, we sent to the school, we actually spent Speech Dude. We spent specific Instagram posts because we wanted to make it digestible, and it's like less than 30 seconds. So we sent like 3 of them, and it was like, look, I do not want to be a burden to you. You have a hard enough job as it is, but you need to know that my kiddo can either be the easiest kiddo you have in class or the hardest one. It's up to you which one you want to have in your class.
And I think that's why PDA kids often have a hard time getting diagnosed, because my child doesn't really exhibit any of the social abnormalities that you were talking about earlier. So many people would look at her and say, she can interact with her peers, she can keep eye contact, she doesn't, flap her hands. There's no way she's autistic, but in fact, her brain is different.
Right. So that's, again, they can be very, very difficult, especially in the early, on the run up to a diagnosis. It can be very, very difficult for parents, for sure. Again, an IEP here, you need to ask for an IEP in writing. There's a 60-day clock that starts as soon as you ask. You can send it an email, you can snail mail it, but you want to put it in writing. You can't just be a verbal conversation with a teacher. I want this, and then so a public school is mandated, federally mandated. They have to do an assessment. You do not need an autism diagnosis to get services. Some autistic children can be covered initially under another impairment. Intervention supports and therapies are designed to impact the child's educational success. If the child does not meet the criteria for an IEP, there's still hope. You can still get supports and accommodations under a 504 plan. Again, I've heard lots and lots and lots of horror stories of different areas, different counties. I've done this presentation in Greene County, done it in Rock County. There are absolutely, I will not, sugarcoat it. There are horror stories out there. There are very, very difficult school districts to work with. Again, a lot of times it comes under funding or funding issues. But again, at the end of the day, you are the child's advocate. And so you have to advocate for the child, and you have to, I understand the school district might be strapped for cash, but our child needs to be successful, and we need these supports to be successful. Okay. So this can be a very, very hair-raising experience. It can be very fearful. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The good news is there's lots of support out there. My wife and I have talked to many, many people, especially in this school district, around how do we do an IEP? What do I ask for? How do I navigate that? As a technologist, I'll be the first to admit ChatGPT can be one of your best friends in the world. So you can use AI to help you write goals, can help you kind of see through, maybe you get an email you don't quite make sense of, you can use ChatGPT. We've done that. So I'm just trying to throw all the tips and tricks and all the tools that I know of into the ether here to try to help you. But again, IEPs can be very, very, especially your first one, can be very, very debilitating and very scary, but it doesn't have to be. Right? Because there's definitely help out there. From an insurance standpoint, there's many different providers and therapeutic techniques. Some are can be a bit what do I want to say? Kind of there's different schools of thought within the autism community as to which therapeutic techniques are better than others. I certainly subscribe to the idea that something's better than nothing. But again, ABA therapy can be very, very polarizing, right? And so it's just something to be aware of, right? Just make sure you ask questions of providers of how they feel, what do they feel, what are their approaches. If you don't think you'd want to go through with it, then I don't think you'd want to put your child through it. Right. That was kind of always been my guiding light. Ideally, parents, you'll visit a number of providers to see which program might suit your child the best. But again, options might depend on your insurance. So speech therapists, there's lots of speech therapists in Dane County, but they all do it very, very differently. So again, try to get at least 3. I recommend at least 3. It's kind of like, I don't want to treat them like a plumber, but again, it's like if you're going to have somebody build your house, you're not just going to take the first person you run across, right? So you want to get some different perspectives, especially if you're early on in your journey here. Every child's therapy plan is going to look different in terms of duration and type. You want to start as early as possible, but remember, autism is lifelong. I think on the next slide, I will talk about older children and teens. I won't spoil it yet, but again, we'll come back to that bullet, starting things as early as possible. But therapy could include speech, occupational therapy, physical therapy, behavioral therapy, social skills, more. Everybody's different. I've had all of these all at once. the calendar gets jam-packed. And I realized that, you know, my wife and I have a certain level of privilege where we can take our kiddos to these things, and we can make sure he has these, and so we recognize that. Not everybody has the flexibility or the freedom to do that, and so you know, it's just, again, understanding what we have access to, and what we're putting in front of Cole to try to help him. But I think the other part to that, though, is burnout is a real thing, right? Therapy burnout can absolutely happen. I think it happened several times with my child. And just the push to make him as successful as possible. Remember, this is still a kid too. At the end of the day, he still wants to play video games. He still wants to play with Legos. We can't fill his bucket full of therapy all day, every day. He still has to have time to be a kiddo. So it's a delicate juggling act for sure. Supports for older children and teens. While many therapy clinics are focused on early intervention, there are a handful of clinics that provide therapy to older children and teens. I'll be honest with you, as Cole started to age out of certain therapies, it got really, the options seemed to dwindle down to nothing to us. And I think we really had to think outside the box. And think of, you know, it's easy to think of, okay, I absolutely need speech therapy, I absolutely need OT, but there are different ways to look at therapies and providers, and don't think of it in such a traditional way, right? And so that was helpful for us. Therapy clinics can provide social skills group or multifamily therapy sessions. The Autism Society therapy page has a lot of resources. Furthermore, we have online game night. We do board game night in person. We also have a lot of preteen events, so basketball camp, football camp, sensory friendly movies. We always take suggestions. There's all kinds of things, you know. And again, if you think about therapy in a very traditional way, once your child gets a little bit older, it can become very limiting, right? And so you really have to kind of expand the way, like, what is therapy, right? So that's important to know. Let's just see here. I just want to go to the chat, make sure I'm getting anything. Denise, thanks for all your questions here. Yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, sorry, Dave, this was a couple slides ago, but you were saying how the IEP process, especially if you're going through the evaluation for the first time, can be kind of intimidating and daunting. Just wondering if you have any recommendations for parents who might just be requesting that now or are early on in the evaluation process? Like any like
Right. I
peer
think there's,
supports or whatever.
yeah, Autism Society can definitely turn you on to folks. I'm happy to put my contact information in the chat. I'm happy to help as well, just from a local perspective. I wouldn't be afraid to ask people to attend with you in your IEP. Be it a teacher, be it a family member, be it someone from the community that you know and trust. These are not meant to be like super secret, we only let certain people in, right? Like, if you want someone in your IEP with you to advocate for you and your child, you're well within your right to do that. Some school districts will try to, and again, I don't think this typically doesn't happen in Dane County from my experience, but in other counties, I don't want to say it's an intimidation tactics, but you can have certain school districts in other parts of the state be very uncomfortable with having other people. But again, you're advocating for your child, so do not feel bad, do not be guilted, do not feel like you can't do something, don't feel like you can't ask for something. I'm always a big believer of you can't have what you don't ask for. So if you want an aid, or if you want a certain, like, if you don't want your kiddo to be in PE class, right? I understand the state mandates you got to take PE, but my kiddo like loses it in that gym, right? Because it's so loud and the earmuffs don't work and he doesn't want to wear closed-toed shoes. Like, don't be afraid to ask, right? And don't let anybody intimidate you or make you feel like you're a horrible person for asking, right? You can't have what you don't ask for. So if you and your partner don't feel like you can do that, or if you're on your own, even worse, if you have to go in as the only parent for your child, it can be a daunting task. It can be very scary. And not every school district is aware of that, or understands that, or acknowledges that. And so I think having as much help and support as possible is always a good thing. I'll tell you, Tracy, in our last IEP meeting, we brought our occupational therapist to the meeting, right? So I hate, again, I'm a sales guy at the end of the day, right? So I hate to treat these meetings like a sales guy, but I want it to be an unfair fight, right? So I want to bring resources with me that are just as smart as the people sitting across the table from me. And so in making the case for services, because at the end of the day, I just want Cole to be as successful as possible. And so I need these services. I understand there's a dollar sign attached to this, and I understand I'm asking the school district to do a lot, but that's why we have public schools at the end of the day, right? And so there's, again, I could talk all day about IEPs. I'm mired in one right now. We're working on Cole's IEP, so it can be a daunting task. And I think especially as your child gets older, when you get to middle school or high school, I don't think it gets any easier. I think you have harder conversations. It can be more difficult. And again, you shouldn't be afraid to ask for things, I think, at the end of the day. Just want to check on timing here. I've got really just 2 more slides here I'll go through. So we talked a lot about long-term waiver or long-term support. Helps kids with disabilities and their family by providing services that help children develop and live their best life. It does use a Medicaid waiver to fund non-medical items for kids with disabilities and that are not normally covered by health insurance. Again, things like fences or chairs or bands or just all kinds of, I mean, a lot of times I think of the long-term waiver, and maybe this is not totally accurate, but I think about, like, if I need stuff for Cole, long-term waiver can help me there, right? So that stuff, you can define it any way. It could be services, could be equipment, could be anything. That's really where long-term support comes from. And then there's SSI. Again, this is not something I've been exposed to personally, but it's a federal program that provides monthly cash payment to meet basic needs for food, clothing, and shelter. That's really based on your household income. I think it's typically, from what I've heard when I've given this talk to other people, usually when your child is a little bit older, maybe 18 or 19 or emancipated. We do have on the Autism Society website, there's more information, contact information for both programs are in the new to autism section. And we used to print binders. I think we still do, but something to be aware of. Let's see here. And then again, I'm trying to be mindful of time here. We all got to get back to work at some point. For insurance support, we do have Medicaid or Badger Care Plus. Again, federally funded state programs that provide healthcare coverage in the state of Wisconsin. Eligibility for these programs are income-based. And then we have Katie Beckett that provides Medicaid for children under 19 with significant disabilities who parents have income or assets that are too high for other Medicaid programs. Again, we have links on the website for that as well. But with that, I think I'm sliding into home here. We got about a minute left. I'll make sure, Tracy, I think we could probably post these slides on Facebook. But happy to provide these. And again, I'll put my contact info in the chat so people have it. Feel free to email me directly or call me. Trying to talk and type at the same time is never a good thing.
While you're typing, David, I'll just add to those who are watching, we will share the recording of this on our Facebook page later today, and it will live on the Village of Cottage Grove Library Board's programming page as well on YouTube.
Any last minute questions? I want to make sure I get everybody out here on time. Other than that, appreciate you stopping by. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me personally.
Yeah, Dave, thank you so much. I think that this is such an invaluable resource. Speaking as a parent of a child who is relatively newly diagnosed, it is very intimidating and it can be a bit scary at first, but part of the process of growing as a parent is just kind of letting go and accepting your child for who they are.
Totally agree.
Well, thank you, Dave. Thank you for everybody who attended today. And I'd also like to thank the Friends of the Cottage Grove Library, our in-kind sponsor for today's event. Hope to see you at future Lunch and Learns. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Have a good day. Thanks, Dave.